If you have the Pew Bibles there, open them up at Matthew chapter 5, and we'll pick it up from verse 9. Just to recap, remember, this is our series is called Meeting Matthew. We're looking at Matthew and his gospel. We've discovered a number of things. It's the longest gospel. It's very much a Jewish gospel written by a Jew initially to persuade Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. We've looked at the Nativity, which both Matthew and Luke give us slightly different nativity accounts of the birth of Jesus. Then we've looked at John the Baptist and the importance of his ministry in preparing the people, preparing the nation of Israel to receive their Messiah. And then we've looked at the temptation, and we've considered how Jesus was tempted, yet he was strong. He resisted the three very specific temptations of the devil. And then we've looked at how Jesus' ministry begins. We know from other Gospels, specifically John, that the disciples began following Jesus on a part-time basis. And then there came a point where he called them to make the commitment and to follow him on a full-time basis, which is where you get where Jesus, coming along the beach, says to them, they're tidying their nets, cleaning their nets, and Jesus says, "Follow me." So knowing that they've already been with Jesus, they've already spent time with Jesus, they've been with him, as I say, on a temporary basis, it makes it less dramatic, less revolutionary, but here they are committing themselves, leaving their homes, leaving their occupations, and following Jesus. So that leads us on then to Jesus beginning with what we call the Sermon on the Mount. Now, just to remind you, as I've said before, Matthew writes thematically. He bunches things together. He puts a bunch of miracles together. He'll put sermons or addresses or teaching together. And he'll put healings together where Jesus heals this person and then that person and so on. He's not suggesting all these things happened at the same time, in the same place. He's just grabbing them and pulling them, sort of saying, well, as we're looking at miracles, let me give you a couple more examples of miracles that Jesus performed. So, we're at Matthew 5, where it says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God." Now, that's not just suggesting, there's a proactive aspect to the wording of that, and it's not just saying being peace-loving or peace-living, but be the person who works for peace. Be the person who is a reconciler. Be the person who brings people together, warring factions. That was one of the things that Woodrow Wilson tried to do when he went to Europe in 1919, at the end of that catastrophic First World War. He was trying to work together at the peace conference, which, humanly speaking, was really not as successful as everyone hoped it would be, because you offended some nations. In fact, some of the nations felt that they were brought in initially and then left out of the whole decision process. There's a whole series of books on that. And a lot of historians will say, well, that's where the origins of the problem with the Japanese. It began in 1919, because they felt they didn't have a fair shot at the end of World War I. The Italians felt exactly the same thing. They felt they were shortchanged and so on. But Woodrow Wilson was trying to bring people together, trying to create this League of Nations, which was meant to prevent any such war happening again. And he did his utmost and so on. Broke his health, as you know, and he ended up virtually a prisoner in the White House. Now, so Jesus is saying those who try to restore peace, not just those people who avoid conflict, because there's lots of people who avoid conflict. They don't want to be involved. They don't want to put their head above the parapet. They don't want to get hurt. You know, it's like that comedy paradox of the phrase, "the meek shall inherit the earth," and the rest of it is, "if that's okay with the rest of you." that is the view of a sort of a meek, non-aggressive, stand up for yourself kind of person. But that's not what Jesus is saying. He's saying those who try to restore peace, those who bring people together, those who are willing to be both light and heat. And verse 10 is, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, if you look at verses 11 and 12, some people say, well, why is 11 and 12 not counted as two more beatitudes? If your Bible is anything like mine, you will have each beatitude listed separately. Is that what you're seeing? Begins with verse 3, blessed are the poor in spirit, and so on. But it doesn't do that for the last two. And so scholars have said, well, shouldn't it be two additional beatitudes? But really, it's Jesus expanding what he says. Verse 10, let's look at verse 10. Blessed are those who are persecuted. Now, remember, the wording is very important. Jesus is not saying, blessed are the people who are persecuted, as much sympathy as he has for all persecuted people, but he's saying why they're persecuted. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness. In other words, for their faith, for their adherence to God, for their following of God. And that's why they are blessed, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, if you think about it, it's very natural that Jesus would be laying a lot of emphasis to the people he's speaking to about persecution. Now, your question may be why? Because the followers of Jesus, after his death and resurrection and ascension, they begin to be victims of persecution. They begin to be hounded, initially by the Jews, who see Jesus as a heretic, see the followers of Jesus as troublemakers, and then by the Romans. There was an empire-wide persecution, the first one under the Emperor Nero, the second one under the Emperor Domitian. And Christians were executed, tortured, put in prison, all kinds. So it's very natural that Jesus would lay a lot of emphasis on what he knows his followers are going to face. They're going to face persecution. They're going to be put in prison. If you were to look at the Acts of the Apostles, in Acts 7, we hear about Stephen, the first Christian to die for his faith. He's stoned by the Jewish members of the Sanhedrin for his faith and for the speech that he makes before the Sanhedrin. If you look at Acts 12, you find the death of James, the first apostle. Stephen is the first Christian. James is the first apostle to die for his faith. He's the brother of John, who wrote John's Gospel and the book of Revelation and 1st and 2nd and 3rd John. We know that Peter was imprisoned. Twice Peter was imprisoned. We know that Paul was imprisoned in Rome and was beheaded and died for his faith. We know that Peter, by tradition, was crucified like his Lord upside down. So persecution was a very significant part of the future of the followers of Jesus. And Jesus, looking into the future, knows how vital it is for them to have this assurance that while they're persecuted on earth, they will be hailed and blessed and praised and honored in heaven. Verse 10, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Verse 11, blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you. Again, there's the reason, because of me. Not just because people are mean to you and they don't like you personally and so on. It's because they are followers of Christ. That's why they're suffering these things. Verse 12, rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So Jesus is looking down the tunnel of church history. And throughout all the centuries of the Christian church, there have been persecution in various places. We in the West are not, it's something totally foreign. We wouldn't think of being persecuted in the way that they have done in other countries, in other eras, in other periods of time. As I say, the Emperor Nero started the whole thing, and he blamed the Christians, which ramped up a whole series of cruel, barbaric attacks on Christians, followed then some time later by the Emperor Domitian. So Jesus is looking down that. Now, let's look at verse 13, because there's two very familiar phrases which come upon us. Verse 13, you are the salt of the earth. Now, that's the followers of Jesus. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. Let's just stop at that one. Christians are meant, Jesus is saying, to have influence. Now, there's different nuances about salt. Salt does a number of things. And by the way, when you read that, when it says, if the salt loses its saltiness, in our modern means of production of salt, that never happens. You buy a pack of salt, it's going to be as salty today as it is 3 years down the road. It's not going to lose it. The salt that Jesus is talking about is the only salt that was dug out of the ground in his day, and it would lose its essence. It would lose its saltiness. It would become, as he says, worthless, useless. Just throw it out, throw it on the ground, because it's no longer salty. It no longer has that sort of piquancy. And so Jesus is saying we're meant to have an influence, both theologically and psychologically. Christians have had the greatest, the strongest influence on society by not being like the world, but by being different from the world. That's a very important thing to realize. We sometimes get this thing, well, if we're just nice, agreeable people, the world, people who don't come to church, people who don't have any time for God, people who don't worship Christ, they're going to be influenced. They're not. They're going to see you as people who really don't have enough strength, enough fortitude, enough courage, enough backbone to stand up for your faith. They may not like what you're saying. In fact, they will hate what you're saying. But they do grudgingly admire the fact you have the courage to say it. That's the difference. Otherwise, you're just agreeable marshmallows. Now, someone has put it like this: the life of a Christian can either be an example to others or a warning to others. Think about the early church. One of the causes of the enormous growth, the enormous spread of the Christian church throughout the Roman Empire was the fact that to the ordinary people, to the ordinary Greeks and Romans who worshipped in the temples, who sold in the marketplaces, when they looked at Christians, when they knew Christians, heard of Christians, they said, what makes these people so different? Their lifestyle is different. They care. They love people they don't even know. They're kind to people. They help widows. They help orphans. They help the sick, and so on. That's what made an impression. The rest of the world was going about its business in this Greek and Roman culture, and they said, what is it these Christians have? If you've grown up Methodist, anybody here grown up Methodist? But God cured you of that? Was that it? you know, John Wesley was the founder of Methodism. By the way, he had no intention of founding a different denomination. John Wesley, all his life, was a Church of England clergyman and was quite happy to die a Church of England clergyman. He wasn't forming a different group of Christians. But the reason I mention that is that Wesley had gone to America as a missionary, but he was unconverted. He hadn't come to faith in Christ personally. And he went out here. He came out to Georgia to try and reach the native Indians of Georgia. Went home a dismal failure. And when he went home, he was on the boat, and he was with a group of Moravians. And he was watching these Moravian Christians on the boat, and there was a storm. And he noticed their faith, that when other people were panicking, they were praying. When other people were afraid, they were confident. And this worked in Wesley's mind. And he thought, these people have something that I don't have. And it was shortly after that, when he got back to England, that he became converted. And he became a Christian. And then he was a man on fire for Jesus Christ. But up to that point, he was just an establishment clergyman in the Church of England. So Jesus is saying we've got to be salt. Now, think of it in the time of Jesus, the metaphors about salt are rich and deep, and they're like a many-faceted diamond. Salt was precious in the time of Jesus. So think of yourselves as precious. Salt was precious. People were paid in salt. I mean, years ago there used to be this phrase, you're worth your weight in salt. Salt was a very precious commodity, hard to get, valuable, worth almost as much as gold. So salt is precious, was used as a form of currency in many places. For salt seasons, it adds flavor. We put it into recipes. We put it into dishes. We sprinkle it on our scrambled eggs. The other thing is salt preserves. In those days, the only way to preserve the food that you had, there was no freezing, there was no canning. You had to salt fish, pork, beef. You rubbed it with salt. It was the only way you could preserve it. Otherwise, it would be rotten. So there's different images of what we're meant to be. We're meant to be precious. We're meant to add flavor to life. We're meant to preserve life. And the other sort of forgotten thing is, what does salt do? It makes you thirsty. And our lives are meant to make people thirsty to know, why do you live this way? Who is this Jesus that you follow? And so on. All of those images. As I say, modern salt is consistent. It'll always be the same. Ancient salt was not. It would lose its tang. It would lose its saltiness. And it's possible. Jesus is saying it's possible to lose your enthusiasm. It's possible to lose your fire. It's possible to lose your faith. John, when he writes to the 7 churches of Revelation, talks about a church that really is just going through the motions. They're no longer vibrant. They're no longer enthusiastic. They're no longer on fire for Christ. They're just insipid. And he talks about, you're just lukewarm. The church at Laodicea, you're just lukewarm. And he describes it like tepid water. Water should either be cold or it should be hot. Tepid water is neither one thing nor the other. And when he writes that to Laodicea, what he's doing, he's giving them a little historical point which they all know, because in Laodicea, they brought the water into the city on this huge aqueduct. So the pipes were open to the sun, and as the water would slowly come down through gravity into the city and be used in the public fountains and in people's homes and so on, the water always came out of the faucet lukewarm. It would always be tepid. In fact, it was said as a joke, when travelers would arrive in Laodicea, some local jokester would say, well, go and take some of that water at that fountain. It's beautifully cool and so on, and they would go and get a drink and spit it out because it was tepid and it was also not too pure. And so when he writes about Laodicea, he says, you're lukewarm. You're neither cold nor hot. I wish you were one or the other. And it's the same idea, the same image of losing your fire, losing your enthusiasm, losing your faith. Now, he talks about you're not only salt, but you're light. The brightness of your faith. You know that in each succeeding generation, people have come through as people have developed. We started off with all we had was the light of the fire, and then we developed candles, and then we had gas lamps, gas lights, and then electric lights, and then flash lights, and all the rest of it. I always remember when Heather and I went to Florida, we lived in Citrus Springs, which was a development, very much underdeveloped. They had very little in the way of street lights. Now, Heather and I grew up in the city, so we'd never really experienced darkness, because in the city you always have lights from somewhere. Lights over a local stadium, street lights, lights from people's homes, store fronts, and so on. I remember the first couple of nights we went outside the house for something or other, and it was pitch black. And I said to Heather, I don't think it's ever been this dark before. But we didn't have any light. There weren't any surrounding lights from anything. The nearest house to us was more than half a block away. So Jesus is saying you've got to be light. You've got to show your faith. It's got to be vibrant. It's got to be both salty and light. And he uses this very powerful image. Now, the church, if you think of the church universal, the church has been at its best when the church has been both visual and vocal. And that was the early message of the Christian church. Now, take a look at verse 17. Jesus then moves in to what many think of as the opening sort of introduction to the sermon, moving into the main points and the meat of the sermon. And Jesus moves into the main body. Now, it's not entirely easy for me to explain to you what Jesus is getting at here, but let's have a go. Look at verse 17. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, upon heaven and earth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of the pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commandments and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and of the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, the scribes and the Pharisees were the hardline Jewish teachers. They were unyielding. They were scrupulous, nitpicking in their observation of the law. They were unyielding. They were legalistic. They were hard. They were very quick to follow the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. You didn't look at it and say, well, now why is God saying this? What is God's point here? What is the main thrust? And so for a lot of the people, Jesus is seen to be more approachable. The people who follow Jesus are more, they see Jesus as sympathetic. They wouldn't come to the scribes and the Pharisees with personal problems, with difficulties, with questions and so on, and that kind of thing. But they will come to Jesus because they see him as open. They see him as approachable. They see him as a breath of fresh air blowing on the dusty demands of the scribes and Pharisees. I don't know, what is the problem with the sound? I have it where I always have it in my pocket. Whoever's listening to this is thinking I'm doing this while asleep, because it sounds like I'm snoring. So they viewed Jesus as being more approachable, more reasonable, more willing to see these things. Now, let me give you one example, which is kind of an obvious example. God, from the beginning, had given the Jews a Sabbath day's rest. Bear in mind, this is in a period of intense manual labor, when people worked from dawn to dusk, when they worked 6 days a week. And so this one day was their one day off. It was their one day to be with their family. It was the one day to relax. It was the one day to recharge their batteries. And God gave it to them to be a blessing. And the Pharisees had turned it into a burden. They had laid so many rules and regulations upon it that you weren't allowed to do this. You weren't allowed to walk more than a certain distance. There was actually a measured distance called a Sabbath day's walk. That's the kind of thing they came up with. You know, you could walk this far. And whenever you have rules and regulations, guess what? You have people who dream up ways to get past the rules and regulations, to bypass the rules and regulations, to outsmart the people who set the rules. We have a collective name for people like that. They're called lawyers. But that's what the Jews did. They began to find ways to get around these endless, and they were endless, rules and regulations. I mean, God had the one basic instruction: let this be a day of worship, let this be a day of rest, let this be a day with your family. You know, it's a blessing to you. It's a day off. And they had turned what was meant to be a blessing into a burden. And they were living an existence which was basically stepping on the cracks. Now, you can turn with me if you want. We're going to turn to the Old Testament, to Exodus chapter 20. This is where God has given to Moses the law and the 10 Commandments, and where Moses gives it to the Israelites. And it's found in Exodus chapter 20. And I just want you to look at it, because you will see, I hope you will see, that the original 10 Commandments break into two groups. If you find it, Exodus 20, two broad groups that we find. God spoke all these words: I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or on the waters below. You shall not bow down to worship them. I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children to the sins of the parents for the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold you guiltless who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. The seventh is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male nor female servant, your animals, or any foreigner who's in your towns. For in 6 days God made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the Sabbath. Therefore the Lord has blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Now, if you're looking at it, up to verse 11, all of those, if you think about it, all of those commandments go this way. They go between you and God. They relate to how you worship God, how you respect God, how you love God, how you honor God. That's the whole thrust of the first section of the Ten Commandments. It's how we behave and honor God. That's the first. So the first section is vertical, between us personally and God. The second section is all horizontal. It's how we interact, not with God in heaven, but with people on earth. How we react to our fellow citizens, how we live with our neighbors. Okay, so it opens up, verse 12, starts with the most important relationship, your parents, who gave you life. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord is giving you. Then it goes beyond that. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, nor shall you covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your servant. So it goes out to how you behave. So the first thing is between your relationship to God, and the second part is your relationship to everyone else. The people who live where you live. Your parents, your family, your servants, if you have any, and so on. He goes through that. Now, the reason I'm pointing that out, you can turn back to Matthew 9. Jesus was asked a question, and I'm going to turn to it. It's in Matthew 22, and Jesus is asked a question which is an old chestnut of a question amongst Jews, about what is the greatest commandment. This is a great debating point amongst Jews. When they would get together, when rabbis would get together, they would say, well, what do you think out of all the commandments of God, what do you think is the most important? What is the one we have to keep on peril of our life? And somebody says this to Jesus, having astonished the teachers of the law and the theologians. It says in verse 34 in Matthew 22, hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with the question, Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law? This is, as I say, this is a standard question. It's an old chestnut. It's a debating point. Here's Jesus' reply. Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like this, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So here is Jesus doing for the Jews of his day what I'm trying to do for you in saying that the Ten Commandments break into two important parts. One is how you behave towards God. The other is how you behave towards one another. And Jesus is saying the same thing. Jesus is saying that there are two aspects. You've got to love God first. That is foremost. That is basic. And then you've got to love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus is saying in this section that the law was, as a system, was to be repealed, but as a standard was to be remembered. In other words, the Ten Commandments are vital. because they deal with those two important aspects of life, the two most important aspects of life. If you think about it, what happened, most of the early church, the followers of Jesus, had been Jews. All the apostles were Jews. Most of the converts were Jews. It was only then when they started to go out, they started to reach Greeks and Romans and so on, and they weren't at all sure that the gospel was meant for non-Jews. But putting that bit aside for a second, what did they do? When they became followers of Jesus, they didn't follow the ceremonial laws of the Jews. They realized that was in the past. They didn't follow the dietary laws of the Jews. In other words, they didn't observe all the, you can't eat this, you're allowed to eat that, sort of all these, what are called the dietary laws of the Jews. So they didn't follow the ceremonial laws, they didn't follow the dietary laws, but they did follow the moral laws of the Jews. They did follow the Ten Commandments. They believed they were binding. They had come from God. But these other ancillary things, they said, as followers of Jesus Christ, they are not applicable to us. And let me just say, there's a bit in this which Jesus really, look at verse 20. If we're back in Matthew 5, look at verse 20. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. That's a very high standard Jesus is placing. He's saying, now you know how these scribes and Pharisees live. You know how scrupulous they are about the different points of the law, but you've got to live morally before God and before people and live to a higher standard to a greater extent. So I think we'll stop at that point because it breaks into then the subject of murder. And I know that most of us are against murder, except in special cases, like people who park in your parking space, mother-in-laws. There are exceptions to the murder clause. Does anyone have any questions? Now, somebody's got to ask something now because I've mentioned it earlier and you've got to ask it. Joyce Dudley's the person who will ask a question. You don't have anything to ask? What a disappointment that is. Deb. Okay. Deb's point is that reading the Sermon on the Mount is setting an impossible standard. Remember, we dealt with this. There were three ways of looking at the Sermon on the Mount. One was, it's not for us today, it's for the future when Jesus comes back, when the whole society will change, when the world will change, and so on. The second one was the social gospel approach, that if you could just get people to live to that standard, then society's problems would be solved. And the third and main thrust for most of the other Christians in the world is Jesus is teaching how to be a Christian and how to live as a Christian. Does that help you? Okay, a high bar. I understand that it feels like a high bar, and Jesus doesn't pull any punches. He does set these standards. He does say, this is what you're to aim for. This is what you're to try to do. On a sort of jocular note, it's a bit like the guy in the court who was sentenced to 120 years. And he said to the judge, I'll never do all that. And the judge said, just do as much as you can. We are required by Christ. You know, the number of things. Christ never softened the demands of discipleship. You know, when people came to him very enthusiastic and said, I'm going to be one of your followers and so on, he never soft-pedaled. He never said, oh, well, it'll be easy, it'll be fine, and you'll be great and all the rest of it. He sets them a high standard, and he says to them, now be careful. one occasion he gives an illustration of building a building, and he says nobody goes ahead and does this unless you sit down and work out what it's going to cost you. And he's saying being a follower of mine is going to cost you. And I understand why you're saying that, but I think that there's a difference between taking that attitude and saying, oh, I could never do this, and therefore not trying. I'm not saying you're saying that, but there are people who do that. They say, oh, well, I couldn't do that. And it's just a polite excuse to get out of being asked to do something. Yes, Deb? Yes. Well, yes, Deb's point is that it could be discouraging to people who are looking at Christianity and saying, well, the bar is set too high, the demands are too great, and so on. But again and again, there is this balance struck. You're saying about a joyous occasion. Following Christ should be joyful. Of course it should be joyful. But there is a balance between privileges and responsibilities. And if you want a historical analogy, that's the problem with the Jews. What did the Jews do for centuries? They focused on the fact we are God's special people. They focused on their privileges, but they forgot their responsibilities. And there's an element of that in the demands of fellowship. I mean, yes, I would love to write a book called The Hard Sayings of Jesus. We all struggle with saying, like, when someone slaps you in the face, turn to them your other cheek so they can slap you again. How many of us are willing to do that? That's an example of saying, well, surely that's unrealistic. Surely that's demanding too much, and so on. And we'll look at that when we get to it. But I absolutely understand what you're saying about it seems as though the demands are too great and it's too difficult. But I think when we look at the balance of it as we go on through the sermon, I think we'll see the demands will still be high, Deb. I'm not going to try and pretend they won't. They are high. But I think we will have a better idea of the balance of the whole thing. Anyone else? No? Okay. All right. So thank you so much, everybody. See you next week.